So I'll start with the beginning. We have our hunter-gatherer groups, which were divided into obviously hunter-gatherer, and usually men were the hunters, women were the gatherers. And so the gatherers had to make the earliest version of what a home was and a place for the hunters to come back to. And although they were nomadic, that didn't mean they didn't have shelters. So the women were actually the first builders and designers of the home. And men didn't really touch that realm. And so in its earliest form, construction and architecture is actually a fully feminine discipline. Then these two layouts were the example of the matriarchal layout on the left, patriarchal on the right. And some of the key characteristics are, for matriarchies, there isn't really a high sense of individualism or hierarchy. It's about the collective unit's collective good. So it's designed as one whole piece, and it easily plugs and plays into the community because it's a grid. So they were some of the first that thought about orthogonal organization. Versus the more patriarchal units, they were more about, we are together, but we still need to have a hierarchy. Who is more important than who is like the patriarch or the one that carries the bloodline. And so therefore, they're going to be more individual pieces. It is designed as a fort to protect themselves, because usually if you live in a more patriarchal settlement, you're going to be fighting with the other patriarchs. Versus living in communities with other matriarchs. And so because of that, it is much more of a defense structure. And even though there are individual pieces, you can clearly read who is in charge based on the size of their home. So once you get to the original settlements like Jericho, we can tell this is a more patriarchal society because of the way that the architecture is laid out. It is a fort. We have individualism even within the unit. And at this point, we begin to see that the agricultural revolution begins to take place, which leads to both specialization and war. So now that people can settle down in one specific spot, they can build up surplus. And so surplus becomes the way to show off your wealth. The more wealth you have, the bigger of a house you would technically have in order to store all of that surplus. And so what we see at this point is that the relationship between men and women in architecture begins to divide itself, so that men have more prominence and more authority over the exterior, since that's what the other patriarchs are going to be looking at. And women take care of the interior, since that was kind of the woman's role at the time, to make the home. What we also see is the urban revolution, which its ultimate manifestation is just new religious thoughts and patterns to organize how these societies work. So what happens to the idea of the woman at this time is, because we are following a patriarchal system, women begin to be seen as not property per se, but part of that patriarch's group. And with patriarchy, it's important to protect women because women carry the children. So therefore they carry the lineage and the bloodline. With matriarchies, it's different because the women don't have to worry about the men leaving or the men going with other women, since they carry the child. So they don't have to worry about what the men do. Yeah. Patriarchies are different. They do have to worry about what the women do. So at this point, the religions that develop have these ideas in mind. And the three original ones that come from this Fertile Crescent Mesopotamian region are Zoroastrianism, which is like the great grandfather religion of Judaism, Christianity, and the Islamic faith. Excuse me. And so in these three religions, in Christian and Jewish beliefs, there was Adam and Eve famously is the reason that they're not in Eden. So we begin to see that in these earlier ideas, women begin to be associated with sin, and the idea of a woman being allowed to do something outside of a man's sphere is beginning to seem a little dangerous. Then in earlier Jewish tradition, there was the figure of Lilith, who was Adam's first wife, who was created at the same time as him by God. But Lilith refused to follow the fact that Adam was creating rules that only applied to her and not to him. And she wanted equality, and for that God punished her, and she became the keeper of all demons. And today Lilith is a name associated with more satanic endeavors, simply for asking for equal rights. And then we have Pandora, who is from Greek mythology, a couple of thousand years in the future, And famously, she was the first woman created by Zeus, and he gave her the box with the 7 sins, and all he told her was don't open it, because he knew that man or woman, curiosity would get to you and you would open it, and it was his punishment towards humans for behaving badly. So in all 3 of these early versions, we see women are equated to dangers when they're left alone. And in Greek tradition, there is this concept of the Maenads, who are a group of women that followed a cult of Dionysus. And usually, like in real life, these were just women that never married and were never a part of the formal Greek society. So it was almost like a book club, to put it that way. It wasn't about reading, but it was just a group of women that were alone, widowed, didn't have a male family member. They would have meetings where they would go out into nature or outside of the city, since they couldn't really host these in the city, since it was viewed with suspicion. And there began to be these tales about them, hunting down men like animals and doing all these vicious things. And this is where we see the early idea that if you allow women to congregate on their own or do things outside of the sphere of influence of men, things can get a little bit rowdy. And that continues well into medieval ages, where we continue to see this idea that men design the exterior, women live on the interior. Things like windows and balconies are really the only way for women to have a glimpse of the outside world with their own free will. Otherwise, they have to be chaperoned or in a carriage to go outside. Fast forward a couple centuries, we still see women are viewed with suspicion when they act independently outside of existing spheres of influence, and we see that with witches. So you could be accused of being a witch for anything. If you happened to find the cure to a poison before the exorcist did his thing, you were a witch. If you lived on your own and you happened to have a mole on your nose, you're a witch. And it was a term that was used very loosely. Anytime you wanted to pretty much get rid of an opponent, you would just accuse them of being a witch, and more likely than not, it would go through and they would be executed. Now, once we get to the 19th century, those ideas seem to look a little old. So we have the idea of hysteria begin to be used by medical professionals who can't really explain why women have certain ills, which we talked about. They're usually mental disorders like anxiety and depression, which makes a lot of sense. When women are cooped up and they cannot go outside, they will develop something. And it could also have to do with just the feminine body, which they did not study because it was considered immoral, so they didn't quite understand like how periods and the uterus worked. So when women had things that today we diagnose as like endometriosis or being infertile, they couldn't explain it any other way than to say she's crazy. And that's where the term hysteria comes from, which today is not a medical diagnosis. It just included everything that they couldn't explain about women. So this is where we begin to build up this myth, which unfortunately is still sort of around today, that women are emotional, irrational, and hysterical, and that's why they can't be trusted to do certain things. And in the 20th century, when we have our suffragettes asking for the right to vote, they are termed as being hysterical for this. And there's images of them being force-fed, and people say, oh, they're crazy, like they need to be sent to a doctor immediately, when all they were doing is just asking to vote. And so we have propaganda like this pop up where it's saying, like, if we allow women to vote, then what's next? We're gonna have the roles completely be reversed, which clearly shows that they knew that to be a woman in that day and age was awful, because they didn't want to be put in that position. But they also didn't want to grant women because they felt that there was something dangerous that would happen with that. Now, in the context of architecture, the suffragettes are fighting for their rights at the same time that the first women are being admitted into the Bauhaus school. So all of these ideas are still very prevalent amongst all the men that are going to form the Bauhaus, including Walter Gropius, who believed that women could not physically think in the third dimension. So he tried to use that to justify why women should not be allowed into the architecture program of the Bauhaus. And when he saw that there were so many applicants that were women that had nothing wrong with their applications other than their gender, he did decide to make it more stringent, and he put a quota on how many women could be accepted to help decrease that number because he didn't like them being there. And he said famously that for the foreseeable future, only women of extraordinary talent would be accepted into the school. But that was the issue. There were too many women of extraordinary talents, which is why he had to bring down that number. So what did women do instead to get around this? We talked about Gertrude Arndt. She never became an architect, but she wanted to be an architect. And when she went to school, they didn't have an architecture program yet, so she tried to do construction, like blacksmithing, those sorts of things. And Gropius blocked her from entering it because she was a woman. But she ended up just doing more like textile works, interior works, and he really loved the way she thought clearly because he has her rug in his office. She just couldn't do architecture. She goes on to become a photographer, does self-portraits on critiques of women's stereotypes, and then she goes back to the Bauhaus, photographs it, and her photographs are one of the richest contributions to our history of the Bauhaus because they're the last images that were ever taken before it shut down. And she also documented the construction of her husband's works because he was an architect. And because of women like her who, because they weren't allowed to practice architecture in the traditional sense, had to go and do other things, we now have a broader definition of it and more documentation of what architecture looked like back then. So usually, photography, academic writing, furniture, textiles, things like that are what women were allowed to do, and that's how they were able to get their foot in the door, but I'm not an architect, so as to not make anyone upset. This is Peter Barron's office, father of modernism, where we have both Mies and Gropius in the background. So the case of Ysaye and Walter Gropius, Ysaye was his wife, he's the director of the Bauhaus, they get married, and together they design the homes where the professors are going to live. He designs the exterior and she gets to design the interior, specifically the kitchen. So we continue to see this idea of separate feminine and masculine spheres in architecture. And he does commend her for it, and he says it's a very futuristic approach to the kitchen, and we clearly see it as a third dimensional piece, even if he refuses to allow women into the studios. Now, when the Nazis take over and modernists are pretty much ran out of Germany, he goes to teach at Harvard, she goes with him. He doesn't dominate English language very well, and she's a writer by profession. So she's the one that writes all of his books, and on the cover, it's really just his name because the editors felt that if they added her to it, it would ruin the value of the books. So to this day, you don't really see Ysaye Gropius, even if she wrote all of them. She also helped direct his personal home. As the director of the school, he had to entertain certain guests, and she would use her closet as a form of personal expression. So we clearly see that there was a need for her to have her creative genius be seen somewhere. And after he died, they created a Grope Fest, which was to celebrate his legacy. And so she's really important in highlighting the contributions of early modernists in the United States. So we see that she's an example of a woman helping to create and promote her husband's brand while going unnoticed the entire time. Then we move forward with Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe, who are mostly friends. So this is a friendship partnership. And Lily Reich was the director, or one of the directors in the Workbund Pavilion, which is essentially an exhibit hall of all things that have to do with modernism, architecture, furniture, textiles, etc. And she curates who gets to show pieces there and who doesn't. She herself submits a couple of them. This is her example for a kitchen accessory, which you can see is very modular, very forward-thinking, and it doesn't require you to build it into a home. You can buy it and put it in your apartments to furnish it. And then, I'm not sure why this isn't a little darker, but one of her critics says that the core of the problem with an apartment she designed was that there has been sacrificed to a desire for ornament, failings of the architecturally inept woman. The bit of unarchitectural cuteness the designer introduces here is, if not a misconception of the entire assignment, a concealment of her weakness. So the rest of the critics loved her apartment design, and they felt that it was one of the most modernist ones, but this specific critic didn't even bother dissecting the architecture. He simply said it's bad because she's a woman, and he clearly says that here. And that was a very common attitude at the time. Now, eventually, she meets Mies van der Rohe, a young designer, and she decides that his work is good enough to make it into the pavilion, so she actually gives him his first opportunity to showcase. Had she not given him that opportunity, we might not know who Mies van der Rohe is today. Together, they go on to design a lot of furniture, and it is important to know that he never created furniture before their partnership or after their partnership. So we know that it's clearly Lily that is driving these efforts, and she's the first woman to design a collection made out of steel supports for furniture. So she's actually quite the visionary when it comes to these pieces, which look like this. They're easy to assemble. They're very clearly in the Bauhaus motif. And yet today we mostly attribute this to Mies van der Rohe. Anytime anyone sees these chairs, they say, oh, that's a Mies van der Rohe chair. Now, eventually, they together participate in a number of different pavilions where they show off their work, and Mies is praised a lot for his cantilever chair, but keep in mind that is one of Lily's pieces, and she's left out of all recognitions. Together, they create the Barcelona Pavilion, for which she was also heavily involved in making sure that it went to Mies to represent the Germans at this world exhibit. And she creates the furniture pieces, and those become the stars of the whole pavilion because they create a sense of space. And she also suggests the famous red curtain, which today is one of the most iconic parts of the pavilion. She also designs other industrial products like a record player and so forth. Now, eventually, Mies becomes the head of the Bauhaus, and he invites Lily to teach there. So she becomes the first woman to direct the carpentry and furniture design workshops, which are usually only for men. A lot of the students complain because of this, and Mies fires back saying she's literally the head of the school. I am the name, but she is the brains, and she's the whole administration that makes this place run. So we see that technically the Bauhaus did have a female designer be a leader at the school for quite some time. Now, eventually, World War II breaks out. Mies van der Rohe goes to the United States along with the other modernists. Lily Reich decides to stay back. She decides to stay because she says that whatever happens, she's first and foremost German, and if the German government wants to get rid of her, that's what's going to happen, but she's not leaving the country. However, being aware of what they were going to do, she stored all his drawings and all of her drawings in a bunker, and they were later rediscovered and put in the Museum of Modern Art, and today they are called the Mies van der Rohe exhibit, but it's thanks to her that we have so many of his drawings, so that's also one of her lasting contributions. Unfortunately, she is put into a concentration camp. She comes out of it okay, but dies 2 years later because of all the mistreatment that she went through. And so what we see is that the women that were designers and that were too outspoken, the Bauhaus women, they were put in concentration camps. Most of the men who stayed didn't necessarily face those consequences, but they also just fled in general. So in Lily, we see the beginning of a classic male-female design partnership where the male partner gets most of the credit despite her being the one that actually helped him jumpstart his career. So next we have Charlotte and Le Corbe. This is another example of a male-female relationship. In this case, Corbu actively works against Charlotte and doesn't like that she gets lots of recognition. So Charlotte is a design student, and she graduates and gets this commission for an attic in a bar. And famously, she makes it out of only industrialized materials. And so it becomes quite iconic and a centerpiece at this exhibit because bars are usually made of wood at the time. She decides to apply for a job at Corbu's office since he is her design idol, and he responds back and says, sorry, we don't embroider cushions here. He doesn't actually take a look at her work or anything in her resume. He just sees Charlotte and immediately rejects it. Then he gets told by one of his partners, actually, this bar that you liked was designed by her. And so he rethinks his decision and does bring her onto the team. They practice together for around 10 to 15 years. And what we see is that Charlotte is the brains behind a lot of the furniture he's known for. So Corbu believes that everything we design should be a machine for something. Not in the sense that it should be mechanical, but in the sense that in the same way a machine is made to standardize a process, a house should be made to standardize living. It should make it easy to live in it. And so a chair, he believes, should be a machine for conversation, relaxation, and sleeping. And he asks her to design these three machines, so to speak. So today, most people call this the Corbu chair, but it's actually all pieces made by Charlotte. The lounge chair in particular is cool because it swivels so you can sleep in it. Here are some of her sketches where we can see her playing with the idea of possible color blocking. And eventually, once the war breaks out, she decides to leave France. She goes to Japan and she studies Japanese woodworking, where she creates a number of different pieces where we see she's learning a little bit of how to not just assemble them, but also the asymmetrical composition of them, using non-standard materials for furniture, and adding pops of color. So when she comes back to France, she does work with Corbu on his famous Unité d'Habitation, which was created to be the modernized version of French living. And this is the one where they have the interlocking units. That was an invention of Corbu's, but the interiors, once again, are created by Charlotte. Everything in the millwork is created by her. And then in particular, we see that back unit, which is the kitchen, does stand on its own, and we can see all of the influence that she had with her Japanese woodworking courses in here. The colors, the techniques, and Corbu is praised very heavily for this when it was in fact her contribution. She also designs the famous coffee table for this project. Now eventually she does leave, and because this is after the war, we see that there is no more independence for women. She goes off on her own and she gains major commissions like these, where we see clearly she can think in the third dimension, and she has a really great sense of cantilevering and structure, and she creates these super powerful forms that really rival the level to which Corbu was designing. And on the inside, once again, we see the influence of her Japanese studies. And so with Charlotte, we see an example of a woman who pre-war worked under another architect, but post-war was finally able to emerge as a designer on her own and work independently. And then finally, we have Miss Marion Mahoney and Frank Lloyd Wright. Did you record the first half when I was talking about her in today's class?
Yeah, in today's class, yeah.
Okay, so I'll talk up until that point.
Okay.
So Marion Mahoney was an artist ever since she was in high school. She was a part of this Art Nouveau movement, and she created pieces like these, which is important to note because that's what her rendering style is going to look like, heavily influenced by nature and framed by nature. So she becomes one of the first MIT graduates that is a woman, and then she subsequently is the first licensed female architect in the United States and possibly the world. And she says that she was hired by Frank Lloyd Wright as his right-hand drafter, drawing, renderer, just partner at that point. And she says that when she graduated, that particular architect, meaning Frank, had in the meantime built several houses of no particular character. So Marion Mahoney is special because she wrote down all her experiences, and she tells us what she thinks of Frank Lloyd Wright at every point in her career. And she's a critic of him as well. She doesn't just praise him for what he does. And she says that he's not a great thinker at the beginning. And so together they begin to develop pieces in what's called his first studio, the Oak Park Studio Fellowship. And here, together with all the other people he would eventually hire, they submit for all sorts of commissions and competitions. And the moment that they win, it's with Frank Lloyd Wright's name and stamp on them. So that's why we attribute so many pieces to Frank Lloyd Wright that were actually designed by some of his fellows, including Marion Mahoney. And all of her contemporaries have said that the person who most often won these was actually her, above anyone else. So she was the most competitive within the field. Now what we see is one of the reasons that she tends to win a lot of these is her rendering style. And because she has an artistic background, she fully went through architecture school and learned how to render. She's quite proficient at it compared to Frank Lloyd Wright, who went to engineering school for a couple years but never got the formal architectural training. He did not know how to render. He only knew how to space plan and create orthographic drawings. And so with drawings like these, she begins to take liberties, and she adds a little monogram that has her initials on it in the corner. And when he sees this, he's quite upset about it because he doesn't want people to know that it's not his work. So he scribbles over it and he says, drawing by Mahoney, but it's after Frank Lloyd Wright. And then he mentions a Japanese artist, Hiroshige. And so not only is he diminishing her talent, he's also likening himself to the level of one of the greatest Japanese artists of all time. So it goes to show he has a huge ego and he can't stand when someone else has the spotlight, even within his own studio. Here's some other renderings just to give us an idea of how she frames them. Another thing she says about Frank Lloyd Wright is that he tends to take credit for the ideas of anyone in Chicago, even if he doesn't know them or he hasn't studied with them. So he says that, she says when she first walked into his office, he had this pinned up there, or a similar drawing pinned up, and she says it was a direct copy of a building of Sullivan's, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's former boss, and that it was Frank Lloyd Wright who followed others and not they him, and that they were the true creative ones. So she's already hinting to the fact that he tends to like to take credit for things that aren't his, and even if he has never done something before, he'll claim, oh, I made them. And that's one of the problems with Starchitects is we believe them and what they say, and we believe that they really were responsible for all this without doing the full research that goes into that. So eventually, he marries his client's wife and leaves his own wife, and that's the beginning of a scandal. Ended up. And then we are going to get into today's lecture, which is going to cover 3 other cases, and then we're going to get into the greater discussion of what the star system is and some of its sort of negative sides. So, we last left off with Frank Lloyd Wright running away to Europe with his client's wife, which was this huge scandal, being that he is sort of like the American architecture star at the time. Marion Mahoney, his right-hand woman, was really good friends with his first wife, so she wasn't really happy about this. And for that reason, when he asked her to take over the office, Marion said no. Now remember, when he was in Europe, he published the Wasmuth Portfolio, which is essentially a group of all of his work, plans, sections, elevations, and most importantly, the renderings, which we can see are front and center. And this becomes one of the top 3 most important manifestos in 20th century architecture. It's super influential on the European modernists who begin to look at this style of rendering and they want to begin emulating it. They love the way in which the home is framed by nature and it's not just this freestanding house in the middle of nowhere. And clearly we can see that the inspiration, or rather the artist behind many of these, is actually Marion Mahoney. And her name is left completely off of the Wasmuth Portfolio, so that it's really Frank's name that becomes very known in Europe. Now, while she is in the United States, again, he offers her the office, she says no, so he offers it to the next best person, who is a male associate. He says yes. That associate goes to Marion and implores her, and he's like, please come back to the office, don't do it for Frank, do it for me, we need you because you're pretty much the one that's in command of everything here. And so she agrees. She does it for the rest of the associates, but in her memoir she writes, later this architect went abroad, meaning Frank. Again, she never mentions him by name in the memoir. And she does recall, he asked me to take over the office for him, and I refused. All right, blah, blah, blah. So then she talks about them having to work on projects on their own, and it's quite challenging because he's away in Europe, and the only way he can communicate at this point is through telegrams, and he doesn't really answer them that often, especially when they come from Marion. She says, when the absent architect didn't bother to answer anything that was sent over to him, the relations were broken, and then she entered a different partnership. So he refused to answer anything that had to do with her at this point because he was so upset that she had rejected his offer to take over the office. He also got into a lot of trouble with a lot of his other associates who at some point had to make decisions on these projects. They were ongoing, the client needed something, Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't answering, so they had to sort of alter them a little bit. And when Frank Lloyd Wright found out what had happened, he absolutely went crazy on the rest of the office.
So Marion Mahoney does end up getting married with Walter Griffin, who happened to work at Frank Lloyd Wright's office. So both of them are architects. Walter Griffin is most known for his planning, city planning, and she, of course, is going to be the rendering machine behind the operations. And together they take on many endeavors. Today, Walter Griffin's name isn't known as well as Frank Lloyd Wright's, but it's definitely known a lot more than Marion's name. And they start designing together. And you can see that once she enters a partnership with her husband, her influence over his architecture is very evident, right? She has the same sort of arrangements in renderings, and now she can take more liberties with it. So she begins playing with color, texture, and the way that these are arranged are very similar to the way that most architecture schools ask their students to arrange their boards, right? You have your star image on top, that's usually a perspective, you have your plans, you have a section, and this artistic representation of the section is something that is still very heavily pushed in most architecture schools, and all that does come from Marion Mahoney. Here's another example where we see she continues to develop her style, and meanwhile the Frank Lloyd Wright office is struggling a little bit because she was the artist and the brains behind their representations. So they do start copying a little bit of what she does, but they can't really emulate it because they're not the originals. So eventually they start applying for competitions, and the city of Canberra in Australia wants to have this huge master plan. This is the era of modernist city plans where we have huge ideas, cities from scratch that are designed geometrically. And so Marion Mahoney and Walter Griffin decide to give it a go, and they end up winning the competition. Now notice the way in which the city is represented is actually very, very artistically well done. And all of these are the ideas that Marion Mahoney brings to the table. And when the jury responds to these, they say that one of the things that really drew them into this project was the way in which they were laid out and represented. So we know that she is in part responsible for them being selected as the winners. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright does hear about this, and a news media asks him, what do you think about Marion Mahoney and Walter winning the commission? And he goes, who? And then he goes, oh yeah, they're great draftsmen, but the ideas aren't all that great. And once again, let's recall, the only person that does not have architectural training in this group is Frank Lloyd Wright. Marion Mahoney and Walter Griffin are both trained architects, and they are not just draftsmen. But he decides to continue using that term when referring to them in order to lessen their triumphs. And that's sort of a back and forth thing that happens between them. This is one of their final projects between Marion and Walter, where we can see that now we have the iconic mid-century look to it. So notice that she creates dotted lines in the reflections, and she's using much more color in them today. And so when you look at mid-century postcards and that sort of 50s, 60s style, it is influenced by her artistry. So you can see the dots a little bit more up close. So in her memoir, she continues writing more about him. There's a couple of things that she says. So she says that there is a certain American, meaning Frank, who, although he was artistic feeling, is really not an architect at all, though he is quick on the uptake. Then she talks about this movement that happened. There was this, let me see if this is the right quote. Okay, yes. So at some point, the swastika symbol was being used as a design concept. This was before World War II broke out and the Nazi Party had super evil implications associated with them. So the symbol was going around as a partie for how to design your floor plans. And she says, if I am not misinformed, the swastika has been used in Europe. And then she says it is now being used in Australia, but, and then this is where she refers to Frank Lloyd Wright, I want to be a lion too, in America is claiming it as his own. He does not wait till he has originated or built a type to claim it. And ultimately, she says it is his scandals that have given him his publicity. So what she's saying here is that this concept that is going around all over the world, Frank Lloyd Wright is telling everyone that that was his idea, even though at the time he had nothing that resembled anything that looked like a swastika, but he coins it as his own. And this is one of the problems we see with the star system, which is essentially when you take one architect, You coin them the star, and then they burn so bright that the contributions of people around them are just ignored altogether in order to make the star burn even brighter. And so Frank Lloyd Wright is responsible for his own stardom because when he talks about his own work to the media, he constantly says, I did this, I'm responsible for that, that's actually my original idea, and so forth. So he is very, very responsible for the stardom that he continues to have today. Now, Marion Mahoney very sadly dies in obscurity. In her original grave, it says, public school teacher, never married, no children, even though she was the first licensed female architect in the world. She had many commissions and she was married. So up until recently, we didn't really know much about her, but recent scholarship has revealed all of the different competitions and all of the work that she did throughout her lifetime. So if you selected Marion Mahoney Griffin as your architect for collage number 2, you do have a lot of work to do as far as research goes, but she does have some great work that will, I think, make some good collages. So in Marion Mahoney Griffin, we do see an example of a woman who was better educated and more artistically talented than her boss, but who was deliberately erased from history, not just by him, but also the critics and the media that surrounded the profession at the time. So it is based on a lot of her work and her labor that he does become known as the greatest American architect of all time. And that's not to say he wasn't a great thinker, because I think Frank Lloyd Wright is a great designer, but it is important to always recognize that designers don't work by themselves and they do not work in vacuums. They always have a group of people supporting them. So there they are, the 4 women in early modernism: E.C. Gropius, Lily Reich, Charlotte Perriand, and Marion Mahoney Griffin, some of the thinkers behind the most iconic furniture pieces, rendering styles, and architectural endeavors in the 20th century. All right, so now let's start the second lecture.